We are going to take a look at disclosing prior reports and repairs, as well as recommendations on how to handle post-closing requests for documents. So, like I said, a lot of our topics come from scenarios that were experienced, questions that are coming up during the week, things like that. Basically broker calls and stuff like that. So, thought we'd cover this topic this week. It does come up fairly often, actually, about prior home inspections and things like that. So let's go ahead and dig into that. So while almost everyone is familiar with the standard rule, when in doubt, disclose, there are still circumstances that can trip up an otherwise diligent agent. Sellers and agents each have an independent duty to disclose all material facts that affect the value and desirability of the property. While this rule may seem simple, mistakes are still made. This happens all the time. So here are some things to watch out for concerning disclosing prior reports and repairs. So I like, if I'm at a listing appointment and a seller's asking me, do I need to disclose? What should I disclose? Things like that. My simple response is always the state of California wants the buyer to know everything you know about this house. So, and that's pretty much true. So everything needs to be turned over to the buyer that the seller has. Warranties, past bids, invoices for work, all of that kind of stuff that the homeowner actually has should be turned over to the new prospective buyer. So let's take a look at that a little bit. Do previous defects have to be disclosed if they have already been repaired? And that is a yes. Even if a problem or defect that existed in the past has since been repaired, this is still a material fact that must be disclosed. And the reason is problems can reoccur and buyers should know what to look out for in the future. Section 4 of the SPQ states this in bold font. So you get down to line 4 of the SPQ. You're the listing agent. You're going over this with your homeowner and seller awareness. For each statement below, answer the question: are you, the seller, aware of, by checking either yes or no? A yes answer is appropriate no matter how long ago. So it states right there in the SPQ, doesn't matter how long ago. If you've lived in the house, you need to disclose this. Furthermore, the seller property questionnaire asks questions specifically about repairs and alterations made to the property. This is paragraph 7 of the SPQ. Asks the seller to disclose any alterations, modification, replacements, improvements, remodeling, so on and so forth, to the property, as well as any ongoing maintenance or if any portion of the property was painted in the last 12 months. So this paragraph 7, basically they just are going down here and they need to try and recall to the best of their ability anything that they've done to the house while they've lived there. So here's an actual scenario that we ran across. Actually, I'm going to give you 2 scenarios. The first scenario is many years ago, I took a listing and it was a newer home. I'd say it was probably about 5 years old. It wasn't that old. Tract style housing. Was at the appointment. We go through all the disclosures. Everything's good. Nothing's happened. It's a new home. What are you talking about? So a bunch of no's all over. And we sell the house, so on and so forth. And then new buyer moves in. The next door neighbor calls me to list their house. I go over there and they're like, oh yeah, I talked to the new neighbor a little bit, this and that. It's like, hey, did they tell you about that huge roof leak they had in the bottom story from the upstairs bathroom? I was like, no, they didn't say anything about that. And he's like, yeah, they had the builder come out and do a bunch of warranty work on it because it happened in the first year or whatever. And yeah, they had a real bad, plumbing leak from the upstairs bathroom, completely destroyed the whole living room ceiling. They had to replace everything. They didn't disclose that to the buyer. Now, what's the problem there? Well, this this neighbor and the new buyer were talking, and that's all he had to say to the new buyer. And the new buyer could have easily gone back onto the seller and said, look, you did not disclose this. And this could have been potentially a recurring issue. Something could happen with that plumbing again. So you never know when neighbors start talking and stuff like that. So, you want to use, stories and things like that had to talk to your sellers about it, the importance of disclosing everything. I know they worry about is it going to stigmatize the house? Yes, but you'd rather the buyer find out about it now rather than a post-closing complaint, because that gets real expensive real fast. So, actual scenario, city has noted there are violations with the property or building. Seller directly spoke to the city inspector, but a copy was not formally delivered to the seller, and or the incorrect name was on the violation document, but the correct address. Would the seller still be obligated to disclose this if they never received a formal notice from the city and or the notice that had the incorrect owner name or document? This is still a yes, even though they don't have it in hand. They had this conversation. City inspector said, look, these are the things you're going to get violated for. They need to be repaired. And maybe, it takes a month or 2 months or however long it takes the city to process this and send them something via mail. Maybe it went to the wrong address, maybe not. It doesn't really matter. They had that conversation. So, that is a material fact, and that is something that needed to be disclosed to the prospective buyer. Even though they didn't receive anything in writing, they knew something was going to be coming on this property. So section 6K of the SPQ can be used to address this type of scenario. So you'll see, we have a little snippet here of the SPQ again. This one's kind of a blanket one, right? So material facts or defects affecting the property not otherwise disclosed to the buyer. So maybe something wasn't covered in all these little yeses and nos on the SPQ. I mean, this thing's like 6 pages long now. It doesn't cover every single little scenario out there. So this is kind of, was there anything else that you should disclose? And then check yes, see attached, and give the explanation for it. So what else? Next up, so do sellers and or agents have to provide copies of inspection reports or other documents in their possession relating to the condition of the property? This is a yes. These documents are filled with material facts that must be disclosed to a buyer. Trying to parse out the document and pick out the facts to disclose is much too risky, so the document itself should be provided to the buyer. I wouldn't do redacting and all that kind of stuff. Just give them the whole thing. And you'll see section 14A of the RPA actually addresses this obligation of the seller. It's saying that during the following time periods may only be extended, altered, modified, or changed by written mutual consent or agreement. Seller delivery of documents. Seller shall within time specified in 3N deliver to buyer all reports, disclosures, and information for which the seller is responsible as specified in all of these paragraphs of the RPA, which I'm not going to go over. But there they are. If you want to look at it, everything that they are basically obligating the seller to provide to the buyer. Also, paragraph 5 of the SPQ specifically asks sellers about any reports, inspections, disclosures, warranties, maintenance recommendations, estimates, studies, surveys, or other documents pertaining to the condition or repair of the property, and instructs the seller to provide copies of the documents in their possession to the buyer. So that is this section right here of the SPQ. So the SPQ and the RPA both reference the obligation of the seller to provide everything that they've ever had on this property that they have on hand. Um, does a disclosure have to be made no matter how long ago the repair took place or how old the document is? Again, it's a yes. We touched on that previously. No matter how long ago, um, this is what the SPQ states. Now, um, if this document is 10 years old, 20 years old, 15, 10, 7, whatever, if it's an older document, you're going to want to preface that a little bit. So um, it it might be less useful to the buyer, but it still should be turned over. Best practice, they should note the dates of the reports and other documents being provided and point out to the buyer that they are significantly out of date. So yes, if you have something from, the seller hands you a stack of paperwork and is like, here, point it out, if those dates are many, many years ago, because that could also freak out the client a little bit if they have this huge stack of reports and all this work that's been done and everything like that. But the owner's been there for, a decade or more, and they just happen to keep everything that they get for their particular property. I know some people are like that with their cars, keep records of every little maintenance thing they do. Some people do that with houses too. So, be sure to preface that with the buyer. The buyer generally doesn't care. But point out the dates, if there is a huge stack and there's some really old stuff in there. Okay, so do real estate licensees have to keep documents related to the property? What about property owners? So yes and no. We all know we need to keep documents for minimum of 3 years. We're required by the Department of Real Estate to maintain the records pertaining to the transaction for at least 3 years after the transaction closes. So now we are the holders of these documents, which, kind of puts us in a position sometimes. So if an agent helped a client buy a property and is now listing that property within a 3-year period, all documents related to the property from the time of purchase would be expected to be in possession of and therefore disclosed by that agent. So for some reason, um, you sold a home, you represented them as a buyer, they purchased this home, maybe it's a military family, I don't know, something, and they are moving out of the home within 3 years. You actually have an obligation to provide that file over to the other agent or the prospective buyer, because you are in possession of it. And that's kind of a tricky one. It's something that we don't think about a lot when somebody moves maybe kind of unexpectedly or something like that, and we represented them as the buyer of the home, and we still have that file. It's been, less than 3 years. So best practice, this should be a topic brought up to the seller so they're aware that you as a listing agent have an obligation to provide these documents from when the seller purchased to the new prospective buyer. However, while many sellers may have held onto the property reports, they have no legal obligation to do so, retain the documents for 3 years. They can take everything from the home purchase and throw it in the trash if they want right after they close, or even during escrow. I mean, some people are good about paperwork, some aren't. Um, but us as the representative, we do have it on file. It's a material fact and it needs to be disclosed. So keep that in mind if you have somebody that you represented that happens to be moving, within this 3-year period. What do I do about post-closing requests for documents from the opposite party or agent and or their client? So this was some advice from Crest Insurance, who is our E&O carrier here at the company. So this question typically arises after closing when new issues arise, such as newly discovered water intrusion, pest infestation problems, that were not disclosed by the seller in the required TDS or mentioned in third-party expert reports prior to close. When problems arise after closing, the selling agent usually is contacted by the buyer wanting advice on how to remedy the situation. The vast majority of real estate agents want to help their clients after a problem arises after the purchased property. However, attempting to assist the buyer or seller client with a dispute after closing could place a real estate agent in a situation of getting named in a lawsuit. And this is what we really need to be careful of. As a matter of law, a real estate agent's duty to his or her client terminates when the transaction ends. So that's, your agency is ended and you don't have a duty to them anymore after, when escrow closes. So if a client comes to you, or maybe the other agent comes to you and says, we have this problem, we need this, we need that, you should just relay that over to your client and don't start giving advice. We are not lawyers, we're not licensed to be lawyers or anything else. We're licensed as licensees, so we don't want to go beyond the scope of our license here. So when you start doing that kind of stuff, it starts to put you in a position, and it actually starts to create agency again if you're giving advice and providing documents to the other side and things like that. So in California, there are no post-escrow duties owed to one's client. Under Civil Code Section 2079.16, buyers and sellers of real estate are advised that real estate agents are not qualified to give tax or legal advice. As such, a real estate licensee in California has no legal duty to give advice post-closing. It is a little bit of a touchy thing to deal with because obviously we want the problem to get corrected and kind of go away before attorneys get involved and things like that. If that does happen, definitely get me involved so we can kind of navigate that a little bit. But we do want to keep a distance at the same time. Should a California real estate agent ever find him or herself in a situation where a client is not happy with the property's purchase post close of escrow or cancellation of escrow, it's recommended the licensee do the following. Send an email to the other real estate agent about the client's problem with a request for a written response, and forward the thread to the client with a suggestion that the client consult with an attorney and or third-party expert specific for the client's problem that has been raised. When replying to the client, be sympathetic and understanding in the email, but also state that since the transaction has closed, there's really nothing else you can do as a real estate agent or broker can do because you're not an attorney, you're not a contractor, you're not a surveyor, you're not any of these things, unless you are, of course. Save all emails electronically and in hard copy for future need, just in case. Do not volunteer to do anything else for the client post-close or cancellation of escrow other than what is specifically stated above. The client asks why you cannot do more, simply state under California law, you as the real estate licensee have no legal duty to do anything more than what is recommended other than send your client requested documentation from your file. Post-closing document request should be forwarded to the client. Should the client not have these documents, they can request from you to provide to the other party. So let's say you represented the seller, buyer's asking, I need this, was there this document, so on and so forth. Don't provide to that other buyer. The buyer should be in contact with the seller directly because this is the dispute between them now. Not the agents aren't involved anymore. So now if your client, the seller, says, hey, they're asking for this thing, do you have that? Whatever it was, report, addendum, disclosure, whatever, you can provide it to them and then they can provide it to the buyer. So you just don't want to be providing directly on the other side because now you're working on behalf of the seller again. So we want to stay away from that. Is a listing agent or seller who is in possession of an inspection report that was paid for and obtained by a previous buyer required to disclose it, even if the report contains language saying that the report may only be used by the person for whom the report was prepared. And we see that all the time on these home inspections and things like that, that this was prepared for this person, it's non-transferable, all this stuff. So many inspection reports contain language limiting their use to the person who paid for the inspection or describing the report as non-transferable. That's usually some pre-printed language on these reports. This language is there to protect the inspector and let third parties know they should not expect to have claims against the inspector for any reason. Such disclaimers do not make the report confidential, and once it is in possession of a seller or listing agent, it still must be disclosed to any subsequent buyers of the property. So that is not a loophole. That's pre-printed stuff. If the report is available, it's in possession of the seller or the listing agent, needs to be turned over to the buyer. We'll go ahead and close out with flipper disclosures for properties resold within 18 months. I mean, this kind of goes along with everything that we've already been talking about, but they made a law out of it. So AB 968, this law is effective July 1st, 2024. So it's coming up into effect. It's already been passed. It's going to be in effect in just a couple months. So if you're working with investors, if you yourself are flipping homes, you need to know about this one so that you don't get yourself in trouble. So a seller of a residential 1 to 4 unit property who accepts an offer within 18 months from the date when title is transferred must take the following disclosures. And that is accepts an offer within 18 months, not closes escrow. So you need to wait 18 months before you can accept an offer, really, if you're trying to avoid this. So the seller must disclose repairs and renovations when performed by a contractor with whom the seller entered into contract. Number 2, the name of each contractor and their contact information. 3, any permits obtained, or if not obtained, the contact information of a third party who can provide the permits. So they're asking for the information of the contractors that did the work to be disclosed as well. This new law should have little effect on the day-to-day practices of realtors. The reason is that first, the SPQ, the Seller Property Questionnaire, already requires sellers to meet most of these new disclosure requirements. Secondly, the Standard Forms Advisory Committee is considering changes to the SPQ that will specifically address any new flipper disclosures, obviating any special practice that an agent might otherwise have to adopt. So, on the next form release, we can probably expect there to be some new updates to the SPQ, specifically addressing this new law. I haven't seen it yet. There's probably a draft out there, I'm sure. We'll go over that in June when they release this stuff. They release forms and advisories and updates twice a year. So, an important aspect of this disclosure is that it is part of the transfer disclosure statement law. So this does, I guess make it have some stiffer penalties. That means the disclosure applies in the same circumstances as the TDS. It has the same exemptions as the TDS and is subject to the same cancellation rights as the TDS and TDS related disclosures. So that one's coming down the pipeline next couple months. Again, if you're working with flippers and things like that, be diligent, let them know about this. If they don't know about it, I'm sure a lot of them have heard about it. If this is, what they do on a regular basis. But be sure that you're following 1, 2, and 3 here. And I can post this into the group as well. Again, I couldn't get the thing streaming, the webinar streaming into the group. Still trying to troubleshoot that. All the settings are clicked, but it's not giving me the option. For some reason, I need to, I don't know, maybe I need to call Facebook or something. So hopefully that helps a little bit with what you should be disclosing, advising your clients, and on both sides, really, advising your sellers of, what they need to disclose, everything they have needs to be turned over. And then on the buyer side, do you feel as if the seller is providing you everything? And if not, requesting it. So, because a lot of times they will piece things over to you and then, you know, they don't give you everything unless you ask, which is improper, but that's what happens in a lot of situations. So now hopefully you're armed with a little more, you know, information on how this works as far as the disclosures. And hopefully that'll help you with, keeping the post-closing complaints, more at a minimum. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. If not, you can always contact me if you have a specific scenario going on. Again, the good rule of thumb is when in doubt, disclose. So, and like I said, what I like to tell the sellers is state of California likes the buyer to know everything that you know about the house. So use that type of verbiage when you're at your listing appointment and they're asking you, should I, should I, should I? That's what I say. And I have them disclose everything. I ask if they have any documentations, reports, invoices, work orders, anything like that. Even if the work wasn't actually done, if they have, a bid or something like that, that kind of stuff needs to be turned over as well. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully everybody has a great week and give me a call if you have any specific scenarios or anything like that comes up. And we'll talk to you soon.